Good evening. I'm Emily Nemens, the editor of the Parish Review, greeting you from Maine. Welcome and thank you for joining us for readings from the summer issue. The Parish Review is old for a literary magazine. We were founded 67 years ago in 1953, and young in other ways. We're 4 months into being a temporary remote organization and still figuring out how to share work in the time of COVID. I find it a bit heartening that in early days of the Parish Review, one editor was in New York and another was in Paris, and the magazine got away. So we know a few things about working together while being apart. Fortunately, now we aren't relying on airmail. We have Slack, email, and for this evening, Zoom, which is giving me a small feedback. Hang on a second. There we go. We've done several Instagram live events and have more programmed for August, but this is our first Zoom live event. Let's hope the internet works for the next 60 minutes, but if we experience any hiccups, please bear with us. A few more housekeeping details. To keep things running as smoothly as possible, we've trimmed the ship a bit and suspended audience comments, and we won't have time for questions, though I will be having a quick Q&A with each contributor. My colleague, Julia, will be sharing links to the readings and further information about contributors throughout the program, so please keep an eye on the chat. The Parish Review has always had a dual mission: to promote the most exciting writers of the day and to support ambitious and inquisitive readers the world over. 7 decades in, we now share great literature on new platforms along with the print quarterly, including the daily, our podcast, short form films, and books. All of this work thrives with the support of our community, and thank you for that support. The past few months have been challenging, to say the least, and I am heartened that we have been able to continue to serve our community with new literature in print. Issue 233 is our first pandemic-produced issue, and online. With such hard news in the world, literature takes on new importance. Sometimes it offers a joyful counterpoint to the despair outside, and sometimes it takes the form of invective or inquiry, a way to interpret the world and its challenges. Art and self-expression are at the center of both, and at this particular moment, I am so glad we are able to host an outlet for individuals to connect and engage through literature. My hope for the Parish Review is that it continues to fulfill that dual mission to answer the needs of its readers and offer opportunities for its contributors. I am so honored to welcome some of those contributors to join us tonight. To begin our program, we'll hear a bit from Jamel Brinkley's story Witness. Jamel is the author of A Lucky Man, Stories, which was a finalist for several prizes, including the National Book Award and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and was the winner of the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. Jamel's writing has been anthologized twice in Best American Short Stories and has received support from Callaloo, Tin House, Breadloaf, and the Lannan Foundation. He was a fellow at both the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing and at Stanford. Raised in Brooklyn and the Bronx, he teaches at the Iowa Writers Workshop. I was at Jamel's New York launch for A Lucky Man. I think it was my very first week at the Parish Review, and I remember thinking how beautiful that book was, and also thinking, I really hope he keeps writing stories. So often after a debut collection, writers pivot directly into a novel. Needless to say, I was delighted to hear that Jamel was still in story mode, and 2 years later, here we are. So let me pass Jamel the webcam. Here he is reading from Witness.
Hi, thank you, Emily. And before I read, I just want to extend my thanks to Emily again and to the rest of the good folks at the Parish Review for their work on this issue and their work on this event. My thanks also to everyone who is tuning in and sharing this time with us. I'm going to read just a bit from the beginning of my story, Witness. Witness. My sister threw open the door so that it banged against the little console table she kept by the entrance. Silas, she said breathlessly, before even removing her coat, I have to tell you something, which was enough to make me feel trapped, as though the words out of her mouth were expanding and filling up the space in her tiny apartment. I told her to calm down and apologized, and then I began making excuses for myself. I had assumed she would be angry at me because of the previous night, so I was primed for what she might say when she got home from work. Don't be so defensive, Bernice said. I'm not talking about that. She tapped my legs so I would move them, and then plopped down next to me on the love seat. The chill from outside clung to her body. I saved my reformatted CV, set my laptop on the floor, and listened. The man who sang out of tune had been waiting for her again. He had started standing near the card shop on Amsterdam Avenue during her lunch hour 2 weeks earlier, and she had quickly noticed his repeated appearance. As she passed him that afternoon, he faced her directly and gave her a meaningful look, which was more than he had ever done before. But all he did after that was keep belting it out in that terrible voice, she told me. A sentimental song, you know, the sweetness of making love in the morning. Even though he was thin and light-skinned and wore those big clunky headphones, not my type at all, she said. Bernice did find him somewhat handsome. But since he didn't say anything, she just went inside the shop. She liked to go in there during her break because her job could be tough. She worked as a guidance counselor for high school kids, soaking up their troubles all day long. And the cards, however hackneyed or sentimental, gave her a daily boost she enjoyed. When she emerged a bit later, feeling affirmed, the man approached her. With the headphones clamped around his temples, his gloved fists tight around the straps of his backpack, he said he was sorry for bothering her, that he hoped she wouldn't mind, but he had seen her walk by the other day and thought, well, that she was beautiful. Meanwhile, she told me, with the kind of night I had, I'm sure I never looked worse a day in my life. She didn't shake the hand he offered, but smiled at how flustered he was. His name, which he said was Dove, pleased her, and the way he scrunched his lips together and shifted them from side to side had what she described to me as a clarifying effect. Bernice laughed now and said, so long story short, I said yes. What do you mean you said yes? I said. I gave him my actual name and my actual number, she said. He's a DJ and he has a gig this weekend. Maybe I'll go see him do his thing. I couldn't tell if she was being serious. You think I'm crazy, she said. I don't, I said reflexively, but only somewhat honestly. I knew that she found our mother's warnings to avoid men on the street excessive. She had told me once that doing so would be like forbidding the use of a shower because water could get hot and scald. Bernice didn't want to be seen as weak, and she always trusted her own instincts. I didn't have much faith in them, though. In my mind, she could be reckless. The previous night, she had texted and called me in a panic, but I wasn't available for her. I was out with a woman when my phone lit up, so for a long time I ignored Bernice's texts, her calls, and her voicemails too. The truth was, I found my sister exhausting. The way she could crowd you out of her life with the enormity of her own. The entanglement I was trying to have with that woman, I told myself, was too urgent to be interrupted. I didn't find out what had happened until the morning, when I finally listened to her messages and read her texts. By then, she was already on her way to work. Unable to reach me last night, she requested a car to drive her to the emergency room. She sat in the dingy waiting area for a long time before she was able to meet with a doctor. And she told him what she told me on the first voicemail. I don't know what it is, but I just feel off. I can't think straight. And my body, it doesn't feel right. She had texted me again afterwards saying that her blood pressure was elevated. But in the doctor's opinion, her issues overall seemed minor, most likely stress related. All she needed to do was relax. So, I said, now you're feeling okay? As the heat hissed steadily into the room, I looked down at the love seat, where I'd been sleeping for weeks while enduring a job search. Perhaps foolishly, I was hell-bent on being in New York, but it seemed like every other Americanist in the country was too. Bernice had offered to let me stay with her until I got my bearings and found something. I already told you, she said. The doctor says I'm fine. So you're fine, I said. I guess so. That's good, I said. I mean, I'm glad. I mean it. But they shooed me away, Silas, Bernice said, her voice growing large. You should have seen it. It all happened so fast. I didn't even get a chance to explain. When she saw the smirk on my face, she glared. What's so funny? You're doing really well with the whole relaxing thing, I said. Terrific job, truly top notch. She nudged my shoulder with hers. Well, I'll be doing plenty of relaxing with my new friend, Dove, if he plays his cards right. That's awful, I said. That's just too much. You always are saying too much. Doesn't matter how much you talk if people don't listen, she said. I picked at the edge of my borrowed pillow. The love seat faced the door to the apartment, and next to it, above the table, hung a framed photograph taken by our late father of our mother and us when she was a young woman. In it, Bernice is 3, cranky from an ear infection, and I am a frowning infant in her lap. Sitting beside us on a stiff-looking blue sofa, wearing a pale summer dress, our mother smiles with her teeth. Well, let me ask you this, I said suddenly now, in a brassy imitation of her. Was that doctor you saw a white doctor? Oh, God, my sister said. Of course he was. She began shaking her head, and we both laughed. I should have remembered what she always says. What was it again? You remember, I said. But when it comes to those white doctors, Bernice cried, now imitating our mother, always, always exaggerate the pain. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamel. It was great to hear you reading from the story. Where you stopped and what's become, a major, the project of the story is Bernice's illness and her encounters with doctors exposing systemic racism in the medical system. We talked about this last fall and winter as we were editing this story, how important it was to discuss that topic in literature. But I'd be interested to hear from you how the story is reading now that we're in a pandemic and those health disparities have been a part of headline news. Does it take new meaning this year?
Yeah, that's a great question. Reading it now, it's one thing that's strange. I drafted it like a year and a half ago, and reading it now, it's interesting in that in some ways it feels like a pandemic story. A lot of the things that are in the headlines now are sort of in the piece itself. Silas is unemployed, for instance. And Dove is basically working gigs. He doesn't have a full-time job.
Right.
Almost all the present action of the story takes place in the apartment. So in that sense, you get that feeling of, quarantining, like sheltering in place. You sort of feel that compression.
I feel that, yeah.
Yeah. And the parts of the story that aren't in the apartment in the present story are in the hospital. So it feels like in some ways the story is in conversation at this moment. And everything you're saying is true, about the ways in which, there are these stark racial disparities in the way that COVID is harming people, and Black people and Latinx people and Native folks are suffering at a far greater rate than white people in terms of cases and deaths. And so, what's interesting to me reading this story is that, I keep thinking about the fact that the three main characters are sort of crammed together in this tiny apartment. And if this were a COVID story, it would kind of be a story of like, how do you manage that space? Like, how do you isolate when you have all these people in this tiny little space, Whereas my story is more about being attentive and being responsible to the people you care for when they're ill, and dealing with medical racism. I think the drama would be slightly different if this were a COVID story, but so many of the elements in it remind me of the moment that we're in.
That's absolutely true. Well, thank you for, seeing into the future a little bit and sharing this story with us. I encourage everyone to read the rest of it. There's a link to the story in the chat. Thank you, Jamel.
Thank you.
Obviously, we can't cover the whole 200-page issue in an hour. There's a beautiful portfolio of embroidered photography by the artist Francesca Calusi, and several great stories, a new piece from Otessa Moshfegh, and 3 talented writers, Bud Smith, Amy Silverberg, and Emily Hunt Cavell, making their Paris Review debuts. Sarah Manguso's essay, Perfection, opens the issue, and well, I think that essay lives up to its title. And of course, there are the interviews. Our Writers at Work interviews are a cornerstone of every issue. This issue, we're featuring Bob Hass's Art of Poetry interview, which was 10 years in the making, and Margaret Jewel Costa's Art of Translation interview, in which she discusses bringing Portuguese and Spanish language authors into English. That intersection of art and poetry, the art of poetry and the art of translation, is where I'd like to dwell for the next segment. This issue includes poetry and translation from around the globe. To discuss the feature and how it came together, I'd like to welcome to the webcam the Paris Review's poetry editor, Vijay Seshadri.
Okay, that was a snafu.
Oh, you're fine.
Am I fine now? Okay.
I think you are. Thank you for joining us tonight. I was hoping that you could talk to our readers for a bit about the genesis of the issue's poetry feature, and then sort of share the narrative of how it came together. And I'll get off the screen.
Okay. Well, thank you, Emily. When you wrote me that email saying you wanted me to do this, you asked me to tell everyone how the translations in the issue were assembled. And I thought reading that the word assembled was too valorous a word to use to describe how the issue came together. The issue came together through a combination of accident and serendipity. About a year ago, I was thinking, well, it might be nice to find some translations from East Asia, contemporary translations into English from East Asian languages to put in the magazine. And I happened to hear that Lucas Klein was translating Duo Duo, which is the pen name of Li Shizling, who's a poet associated with Tiananmen Square. He was exiled for a while and then he went back and he now lives in China. And so I wrote to Lucas and asked if he was interested in sending some poems to us. And he did send some poems. At the same time, Krupa Shandilia, who is translating along with her collaborators, the Urdu poet Miraji, the modernist Urdu poet, wrote to me and said, would I be interested in looking at some translations? So I began thinking, that we would have a few people. And then I went to Lithuania and I found a wonderful poet, Kęstutis Navakas. I went to Lithuania to go to a poetry festival there. And I found not only a wonderful poet in him, but a wonderful literary tradition that was really a major tradition that was unrecognized simply because of the small number of speakers of Lithuanian. And so they required translation. And right after that, and that was kind of an accidental sort of confluence of events. And but right after that, the serendipitous entered into the process because Patricio Ferrari, who is going to read after I stop speaking, wrote to me and asked me if I was interested in any of the translations of the Portuguese poet António Osório that he was doing. And he also informed me at that time that he was working with Margaret Jewel Costa on a complete Alberto Caeiro. And Alberto Caeiro is the master heteronym of the great modernist poet, Portuguese poet, Fernando Pessoa. And so things started coming together in this very unusual way. And I just sort of followed the current rather than assembled anything. And but I think that was the critical mass, especially because, you know, Pessoa is a very important poet for me. And Patricio and I had actually been on a panel where we discussed the recent translation by Margaret Jewel Costa of the Book of Disquiet, the prose masterpiece by the Pessoan heteronym Bernardo Soares. And so I thought, wow, this is kind of cool. Why don't we just do a translation issue or an issue that was largely translation? And then I started filling it out, and other things came into the mix. David Lehman sent Emily his some of his new translations of Baudelaire's Ligne de Paris, and by the end of the year, we had a substantial translation issue, which was made even more kind of wonderful by the fact that Emily had been, had commissioned a Art of Translation interview with Margaret Jewel Costa. And that just fell right into place with everything else. And that was how the issue came into being. I asked a few other people if they had translations, and they sent me translations. And I thought it worked out very nicely, but, you know, I'd hate to take credit for it. It was almost, you know, something that was done to me rather than something I did or something we did. And that's the story of the issue and how it came about. I mean, I'm surprised reading the poems how well they hang together with each other, how well they play together with one another. And I don't know, I've been thinking about, well, you know, there's probably an essay here. I don't know if I'm going to write it or not, but it certainly would be an interesting one. And yeah, and it's certainly the case that there is a huge amount of translation activity now, all of it really quite fascinating. I mean, this is just a small sample of what's out there in English now. And it's sort of fascinating to see how much activity, how much global activity there is. I'm going to stop there and introduce Patricio, who's going to read from Alberto Caeiro and from António Osório. And he's going to read both the English and the Portuguese. And Patricio is a poet and an editor and a translator who is at home in many languages. His recent translations include The Galloping Hour, which are French poems by Alejandro Pizarnik. Alejandra Pizarnik, he translated those with Forrest Gander, and the complete Alberto Caeiro, which he translated with Margaret Jewel Costa. And I will turn the screen over to Patricio.
Thank you, Vijay, for that introduction, for your kind words. Thank you, everyone at the Paris Review, for putting together this wonderful issue. And thank you, everyone out there in the US and beyond, in all the continents. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with everyone today. The first poem that I will share is the opening poem by Alberto Caeiro, as Vijay said, is Pessoa's main heteronym, the one who Pessoa and the two other heteronyms considered to be their master. Caeiro wrote The Keeper of Sheep. It's a collection of 49 poems. The one that I will share with you in its entirety in English and then with some Portuguese opens the collection and is one of the longer ones in the book. Then I will share two poems by António Osório. Eu nunca guardei rebanhos, mas é como se os guardasse. Minha alma é como um pastor, conhece o vento e o sol, e anda pela mão das estações a seguir e a olhar. Toda a paz da natureza, sem gente, vem sentar-se a meu lado, mas eu fico triste como um pôr de sol para a nossa imaginação, quando se vê acabar ao longe e se sente a noite já entrada, como uma borboleta com a janela aberta. I never kept sheep, but it's as if I had. My soul is like a shepherd. It knows the wind and the sun and walks hand in hand with the seasons, following and looking. I never kept sheep, but it's as if I had. My soul is like a shepherd. It knows the wind and the sun and walks hand in hand with the seasons, following and looking. All the peace of peopleless nature comes to sit by my side, but I feel as sad as the sunset is to our imagination when we see it fading in the distance and feel the night enter like a butterfly through the open window. But my sadness is soothing because it's natural and right, and is what should be there in the soul when it already thinks it exists and our hands pick flowers without the soul even noticing. With the clanking of sheep bells, beyond the bend in the road, my thoughts are contented. I'm only sorry to know they are contented, because if I didn't know that, instead of being contented and sad, they would be joyful and contented. Thinking is as unpleasant as walking in the rain. Thinking is as unpleasant as walking in the rain, when the wind builds and makes the rain seem heavier. I have no ambitions or desires. Being a poet is not my ambition. It's my way of being alone. Não tenho ambições nem desejos. Ser poeta não é uma ambição minha. É a minha maneira de estar sozinho. I have no ambitions or desires. Being a poet is not my ambition. It's my way of being alone. And if sometimes I want, in my imagination, to be a little lamb, or to be the whole flock, and wander over the entire hillside, and be many things at the same time, it's only because I feel what I write at sunset, or when a cloud passes a hand over the light, and a silence runs away through the grass. When I sit down to write verses, or when walking the path or trails, I write verses on a piece of paper in my mind. I feel a shepherd's crook in my hand, and I see another me on top of a hill, looking down at my flock and seeing my ideas, or looking down at my ideas and seeing my flock, and smiling vaguely like someone who hasn't understood what was said, but pretends that he has. I salute all those who read me, taking off my broad brim hat to them when they see me at my door as their carriage appears over the hill. I salute them and wish them sun and rain when rain is needed. And for their houses to have next to an open window a favorite chair where they sit reading my verses. And that when they read my verses, they will think that I am some natural thing. For example, the ancient tree in whose shade, when they were children, they would flop down, weary with playing, and wipe the sweat from their hot brow with the sleeve of their striped smock. E ao lerem os meus versos, pensem que sou qualquer coisa natural, por exemplo, a árvore antiga, a sombra da qual quando crianças brincavam com um baque, cansados de brincar, e limpavam o suor da testa quente com a manga do viver riscado. E a lerem os meus versos, pensem que sou qualquer coisa natural, por exemplo, a árvore antiga, a sombra da qual quando crianças se sentavam com um baque, cansados de brincar, e limpavam o suor da testa quente com a manga do viver riscado. I will share now 2 poems by António Osório, poems that António Osório published in his first collection in 1972, Raiz Afectuosa, The Tender Root. It was back in the day António was 39 years old. António is almost 87. He is going to be 87 next week. And these 2 poems come from the first collection. The first poem is entitled Crater of the Beginning, Crátera do Início. Crater of the Beginning. Crater of the beginning, mud of death, endless wreckage. Is this your world, the serpent you forged over 7 long nights? Crater of the beginning, mud of death, endless wreckage. Is this your world, the serpent you forged over 7 long nights? You were freshness in a well of cloistered water and the wondrous balance of sky over earth. I reject those hands, your fundamental bitterness, these corrodible eyes, just one day for you to build a world, but you came from the rib of man and on his side continue to drown. Bastava dia para construir esse mundo, mas saíste da costela do homem e ao seu lado sempre te afundas. Just one day for you to build the world, but you came from the rib of man and on his side continue to drown. The next poem is September, Setembro. Sudden September thunderstorm, sudden September thunderstorm, then long wearisome rains. Still on the beach, the fresh rush of waves, the indifference of fallen medronho fruits, and the sudden grave look of a 2-year-old son. Vines that bleed, grapes reaching their end, some leaves down, and trees like flowers awaiting the quiet flight of insects and the whisper of an imminent arrival. Repentina trovoada de setembro e depois chuvas exaustas. Ainda na praia a corrida juvenil das ondas, o abandono dos medronhos caídos e súbito olhar grave de filho de 2 anos. Vines that bleed, vinhas que sangram, grapes reaching their end, uvas caminhando para o seu fim, some leaves down, algumas folhas que descem, e as árvores como as flores, esperando, and trees like flowers awaiting the quiet flight of insects and the whisper of an imminent arrival. A partida silenciosa dos insectos e o sopro de uma breve chegada. E o sopro de uma breve chegada. Obrigado.
Thank you, Patricio. You know, I am at a borrowed house and visiting family, but I was thinking of sitting next to an open window, a favorite chair, reading my verses, and check. It was great to hear you read your translations and to hear also the original Portuguese. I had just one quick, well, not quick question, but I did want to touch on that aspect of translation, thinking about the language of two eras, these two poets writing in Portuguese, but with most of a century between them. How did you operate with both concurrently? As you're looking at these lines, is their Portuguese similar, and how does it vary? And how do you even begin to start presenting that difference in English?
Thank you, Emily. That's a very interesting question and very pertinent, certainly when we think about both the simplicity and complexity of Caeiro, which Pessoa intended, and the simplicity that runs through António's work, yet at the same time of richness and of an intertextual richness that certainly touches on literature, but expands into the universe in a different way that Caeiro's poetry does. And first and foremost, I'd like to say that, and I'd like to salute both Margaret Jewel Costa, my co-translator with Alberto Caeiro, and many more Pessoa books to come with New Directions, and Susan Margaret Brown, with whom I am translating António Osório. Caeiro is a poet whose language is simple at first, or simple throughout. However, so by simple here, I mean you will hear words like árvore, rio, água, flores, flowers, trees, rocks, stones. He will not be specific. Whereas in António Osório, you will hear, for instance, medronho fruit, right, which is that wonderful plant that gives us the aguardente, the fire water, or burning water for this wonderful Portuguese traditional fruit brandy. And when Caeiro is simple in lexicon, yet complex in thought, Pessoa with Caeiro will be exploring something that prior to Pessoa, for instance, someone who taught a lot of what we know of Pessoa, Walt Whitman, a lot of contradiction in Caeiro. Caeiro is simple, yet at the same time, he will be thinking, reflecting about his sensations. He will be naming them in a very simple, straightforward way, yet thinking, reflecting about them in a very slight way. And in Caeiro, we will have to look for the influences, the literary influences. Other heteronyms will bluntly mention them. Alberto Campos will mention Campos. Caeiro will not. However, in Caeiro, you have I salute all those who will read me. I salute, of course, takes us back to Walt Whitman's Salut au Monde, poem 51, and songs of myself, Leaves of Grass. So we have a history of literature, if you will, in Pessoa. No matter what voice, what heteronym, what fictitious author you read, in António, you will have tributes to his beloved Italian poets, Spanish poets, but also North American poets. We have Emily Dickinson, for instance, in António's first collection. Very minute António, nearly extinct professions he will be writing about, the Lisbon pavers, for instance, or he will be mentioning rivers in the countryside. He will be mentioning other, the flora and the fauna of Portugal, insects. It's very minute, and at the same time exploring ekphrastic poetry, which is something that completely different from Pessoa. As far as we know, Pessoa didn't explore ekphrastic poetry at all. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you. It was great to hear from both authors. It's good to see you. You read just a portion of the two translations, so there's more to be read of Patricio's translations, and I encourage everyone to explore those. To round out the evening, we'd like to move away from poetry and translation. There's another interesting pairing in the poetry of the issue. We have posthumous work from Allen Ginsberg, a long poem that had previously only appeared translated into French, and two poems by Lucille Clifton. For those unfamiliar with her work, Lucille Clifton was an award-winning poet and author of children's books. Her poetry collection, Blessing the Boats, New and Selected Poems, won the National Book Award for Poetry. In 1988, she became the only author to have two collections selected in the same year as finalists for the Pulitzer Prize: Good Woman, Poems and a Memoir, and Next, New Poems. In 1996, her collection, The Terrible Stories, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Among her many other awards and accolades are the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, the Frost Medal, and an Emmy. In 2013, her posthumously published collection, The Collected Poems of Lucille Clifton, edited by Kevin Young and Michael Glasser, was awarded the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Poetry. Aracelis Girmay is the editor of a new volume of Clifton's selected poems, How to Carry Water, which will be coming out in September. The book includes several previously unpublished works, including two that debuted in the Paris Review this summer. Aracelis will read those and also share a bit more about Clifton's writing and the work of assembling this book. Aracelis Girmay is the author of 3 books of poems, The Black Maria, Kingdom and Amelia, and Teeth. She is the author and illustrator of the collage-based picture book, Changing, Changing, and with her sister collaborated on the forthcoming children's book, What Do You Know? For her work, Girmay has been nominated for a Neustadt International Prize for Literature and received the Whiting Award for Poetry. In 2018, she was selected by Elizabeth Alexander to receive the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award. Girmay is on the editorial board of the African Poetry Book Fund. Here's Aracelis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, and thanks to all my fellow panelists. It's really a gift and honor to be with you tonight. There's a storm that's setting in, so I hope the light stays. I just want to thank again Emily, Craig, Julia, and the rest of the Paris Review crew for all of the work on this issue and just in general. I also would like to dedicate my part of this reading to the poet Camilla Aisha Moon and her brilliant late mother, Carolyn Moon. Aisha and I were together in Lucille Clifton's archives when the previously unpublished poems included in the selected showed us their faces. And as Emily said, 2 of those poems are in this summer's issue. So I thought what I would do is I'd read an older poem of Clifton's and then read an excerpt of from the foreword, and then I'll read some more Clifton poems. This is called Mulberry Fields. They thought the field was wasting, and so they gathered the marker rocks and stones and piled them into a barn. They say that the rocks were shaped, some of them scratched with triangles and other forms. They must have been trying to invent some new language, they say. The rocks went to build that wall there, guarding the manor, and some few were used for the state house. Crops refused to grow. I say the stones marked an old tongue, and it was called eternity, and pointed toward the river. I say that after that collection, no pillow in the big house dreamed. I say that somewhere under here molders one called Alice, whose great-grandson is old now too, and refuses to talk about slavery. I say that at the master's table, only one plate is set for supper. I say no seed can flourish on this ground, once planted, then forsaken. Wild berries warm a field of bones. Bloom how you must, I say. This is from the foreword. No one writes like Lucille Clifton, and yet, if it were possible to open a voice like a suitcase, to see what it carries inside it, I believe that inside the voices of many contemporary US American poets are the poems of Lucille Clifton. There's the ferocity of her clear sight. There's the constellatory thinking where everything is kin. The verbs of one body might also be the verbs of another seemingly disparate or distant body. Her streetlights, for example, bloom. And all things have agency. As the speaker of the poem August the 12th mourns a distant brother on his birthday, the speaker's hair cries too, quote, "My hair is crying for her brother," end quote. The poems, in their specificity and dilating scale, startle readers into new sense. They discomfort as often as they bless, and they bless as often as they wonder, bearing witness to joy and to struggle. Her works are explicitly historical and of a palpable present moment, even now. The earliest of the poems in the selected are written during the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the nuclear age, ecological crises, and independent movements across Africa. As the poet Kevin Young writes in the afterword of the monumental collected, quote, "Both the poetry world and the world of the 1960s were in upheaval. The years from 1965 to 1969 saw the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the first human walking on the moon, all of which appear in the poems. The Black arts movement, which Lucille Clifton found herself a part of, and in many ways helped to forge, insisted on poems for and about Black folks, establishing a Black aesthetic based on varying ways of Black speech, African structures, and political action," end quote. Clifton's first book, Good Times, was published when her children were ages 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, which never ceases to amaze me. Her daughters, Sydney, Jillian, and Alexia, remember their mother's writing as part of their daily life. They say, "As children, we watched our mother type on her old-fashioned typewriter at the dining room table. For us, this is what mothers did and where they did it. Create worlds, play games, and share meals in the same place. Her creating space was her sanctuary and ours. So it is with every word." Such insistence on acknowledging all worlds and all spaces has emboldened and nourished so many of us otherwise encouraged to shut down our truest circuitry. Instead, her poems pulse with the miracle of the porous and daily. Distilled yet capacious, her poems, like seeds, are miraculous vessels of past and future, of dense and elemental possibility. However large the story they carry, they are always scaled to the particular and resonant detail which amplifies the world at their center. And I'll read some poems. These first two are in the summer issue of the Paris Review. Poem to my yellow coat. Today I mourn my coat, my old potato, my yellow mother, my horse with buttons, my rind. Today she split her skin like a snake, refusing to excuse my back for being big, for being old, for reaching toward other cuffs and sleeves. She cracked like a whip and fell apart. My terrible teacher to the end. To hell with the arms you want, she hissed. Be glad when you're cold for the arms you have. And this poem, Bouquet. I have gathered my losses into a spray of pain. My parents, my brother, my husband, my innocence, all clustered together, durable as daisies. Now I add you, little love, little flower, who walked unannounced into my life and almost blossomed there. I'll read 4 poems that I've carried with me a long time. Study the masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron or one like hers that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too, words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America. This morning for the girls of Eastern High School. This morning, I met myself coming in. A bright jungle girl shining quick as a snake. A tall tree girl, a me girl. I met myself this morning coming in. And all day I have been a black bell ringing. I survive, survive, survive. Generations. People who are going to be in a few years bottoms of trees bear a responsibility to something besides people. If it was only you and me sharing the consequences, it would be different. It would be just generations of men. But this business of war, these war kinds of things, are erasing those natural, obedient generations who ignored pride, stood on no hind legs, begged no water, stole no bread, did their own things. And the generations of rice, of coal, of grasshoppers, by their invisibility, denounce us. And this last poem, A Dream of Foxes. In the dream of foxes, there is a field and a procession of women clean as good children. No hollow in the world, surrounded by dogs. No fur clumped bloody on the ground. Only a lovely line of honest women stepping without fear or guilt or shame, safe through the generous fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Aracelis. That was beautiful. We're nearly up to an hour, but I did want to ask you one question, which is, you said you were in the archive with Camilla Aisha Moon, looking through Clifton's papers. What did it feel like to encounter new work, things you hadn't seen before? What were the two of you thinking? What were you saying? I'd love to just hear about that moment.
Yeah, I can tell you briefly. It was really special. We sat in the room where we could be together looking on the first day. And then we separated and did our own work on the second day. But, I've been thinking a lot about how when gathering work for the selected and, curating and thinking about what would be included, I had so many conversations and talked to whoever would talk to me. And I could feel her work, Clifton's work, bringing me closer to other people, even my beloveds. So we were just astonished. We read things out loud. We laughed really hard. We like paid attention to every detail, drawings that her kids made on the sides of the margins. We read together and asked each other questions about like what the poems made us think. So I do feel like it felt almost like a wedding ceremony of sisterhood somehow, because she's a poet who's so important to us. So it was really a profound and special, joyous occasion.
That sounds amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that story with us, and thank you for sharing Clifton's work. At the risk of it feeling like the Brady Bunch, I'd like to welcome all of our speakers back onto the screen for just a minute. Great. Well, thank you, Jamel, Patricio, and Aracelis for your work and for sharing it here with us. It was so exciting for me as an editor to encounter it on the page, and it was wonderful to hear it tonight. Thanks to you too, Vijay, for all your work. Every quarter is an adventure.
I'm here. You can't see me.
That's fine. I'm still saying thank you. It's a joy to work with all of you, and thank you to everyone who joined us on Zoom tonight. Thank you for finding a place for the Parish Review in what has been a remarkable and challenging season. I hope this evening is just remarkable. We are sharing a link in the comments for anyone who wants to get the issue, subscribe, or buy this particular volume. I will say the summer issue is, this was just a taste of what's in the issue, and it's one installation of 233 issues of the Parish Review. Subscribers get access to our digital archive, which has every issue in its entirety. So it's a real wealth. I'll mention it will soon be 234 issues. The fall issue, our second pandemic volume, will be heading out to the printer on Friday, and I look forward to sharing that and gathering again in the autumn. For now, thank you all for joining us. Stay safe, read well, and have a good night. Thank you again.